first love, or our foundation, when the company started in 2007, was absinthe. And my business partner, Peter Schaff, he's an American that lives in Paris, married a French woman. He lives near the Paris flea market, and he's a big antique fanatic, and he would go to the Paris flea market and he would start coming across these absinthe antiques. And so he started doing some research, and this was 2001, 2002. Started doing a lot of research on it. He started coming across sealed bottles of absinthe known as pre-ban absinthe, stuff that was made before 1915 when it was banned. And he started kind of networking with other absinthe enthusiasts, like Ted Bro, for example. In fact, he's the one that found the Comier distillery in Saumur for Ted, and was able to kind of get him started making absinthe over there. But he was one of the early pioneers of the modern absinthe renaissance. And when I say modern absinthe renaissance, I refer to more of a true absinthe renaissance. Not necessarily the stuff from the 80s and the 90s that in the Czech Republic they were essentially macerating herbs in alcohol, using artificial coloring, giving it to tourists. A lot of American tourists had their first taste of absinthe in Czechoslovakia, burning sugar cubes, etc. Historically, Eastern Europe really didn't have much of a history with absinthe, and true absinthe was never macerated, it was always distilled. And the qualities that you get from the herbs, especially the wormwood, when you distill it as opposed to macerate it, are extremely significant. Most of the bitterness, the real bitter components of wormwood, are left in the tails after the distillation, and when you macerate, you get nothing but all that bitterness. And so people came to think that absinthe was something that really was kind of this nasty thing that you kind of took down. It maybe had some hallucinogenic properties to it, and it was kind of cool, and because they heard about the legends that it had with the artists and philosophers, most particularly in France, and that they're doing something that, you know, these guys thought were cool, so therefore, you know, they want to experience it too. The unfortunate thing is what they were drinking was not what the artists and the philosophers were drinking. What they were drinking was something far different. In a short, if you have an absinthe and it tastes bad, it's just a bad absinthe. When absinthe is made well, it is elegant. It's a really beautiful liqueur, although it doesn't have any sugar in it. But historically, any absinthe had to have three things in it. It's called the Holy Trinity: wormwood, green anise, and fennel. Sometimes star anise was used, but that would typically be used in the Swiss Le Blues, the clear absinthes. It has a lot more anethol in it than green anise, and anethol is where you get that licorice type flavor. And so with star anise having so much more, you will notice much more of that flavor component in the Swiss Le Bleu, which also does not have that secondary coloring step where you get the green compared to the burnt. And I can touch on that a little more later on. So my first taste of absinthe when I'd go and visit Peter was a 1910 bottle of C.F. Berger absinthe. And over time I also enjoyed other absinthes, including a number of bottles of historic Pernod absinthe, which was probably the most important brand of its day. The interesting thing about absinthe is that when it is in the bottle, due to its high content of herbs and essential oils that come from the herbs, it actually ages in the bottle. The same thing happens with Benedictine and Chartreuse. I don't know if you're familiar with the kind of that underground market for vintage Chartreuse, but it's pretty robust, and the bottles regularly go for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a bottle. And part of it's because when it ages, it is absolutely spectacular. A lot of the Angelica that you get up front in new Chartreuse almost recedes into the background, and other flavors come forward that are really integrated and complex. The same thing happens with the absinthe, and certainly it's not similar to what happens with whiskeys and scotches, that once you take them out of the barrel, it pretty much stops, and what you get in the bottle is what happened once it stopped its aging process in the barrel. The thing that sometimes people fail to fully appreciate about absinthe, and actually something that's true with a lot of spirits that are based on organic ingredients, natural ingredients, is that terroir is just as important and significant to these spirits as it is for, say, wine. People like to talk about, where the wine grapes are grown, what's the terroir, what kind of qualities and properties they're getting from the environment, the weather, the soil conditions, the elevation. That's the same with things like wormwood, green anise, Florence fennel. And sometimes, well, since it is so underappreciated, sometimes you'll have producers that will produce a product like an absinthe, and they'll say, okay, the recipe says I need wormwood. So they call up an herb supplier and they order some wormwood. So they get their wormwood. I need green anise. So they order up some green anise. I need some fennel. They order up some fennel. And there's been a lot of times when I've had an opportunity to talk to different absinthe producers around the world, and I say, well, where does your wormwood come from? Well, I order it from so-and-so. Well, where specifically is it grown? I don't know. But to know is extremely important. For example, the Vieux Pontarlier uses Pontarlier wormwood, and that terroir was the most famous terroir for growing wormwood. And in its day during the Belle Epoque, you had about 32 of the major absinthe brands based in and around Pontarlier. And this is a very small provincial city near the West Swiss border, and it only had a population of maybe 20,000 people in the whole region. And here you have 32 major brands, including Pernod Ricard was there. In fact, their distillery property is still there, but it's completely gutted, and it's now a Nestle chocolate milk factory. But you can walk around the town of Pontarlier, and not only will you see the old distillery buildings of these famous brands that you've seen posters of, but you can actually see the residences of the different, the people that founded these distilleries. And it's, it's almost like, rock stars, to an absinthe aficionado. It's just an amazing area to just kind of soak in the history of absinthe. But part of the reason why all these brands kind of clustered around Pontarlier is because here you are at about an elevation of about 2,000 feet on a plateau right at the base where the Swiss Alps start to take off, and you get a lot of exposure in the summer, and you get a lot of cold and snow on the ground in the winter. But that terroir grew amazing wormwood. It was amazingly aromatic, amazingly floral. So we knew that Pontarlier wormwood was special when we were using it for the Vieux Pontarlier. But how it compares to other wormwood was something that was very curious to us. So what we did is something that a lot of distillers have rarely done themselves. We took neutral spirit, and we took the same amount of spirit and the same amount of weight of wormwood, and we distilled separately Pontarlier wormwood. The most common wormwood that you'll get if you call up an herb supplier and order some, it probably comes from Hungary. They grow a lot of it. Different terroir. We distilled some Hungarian wormwood, and then we got a hold of some domestic wormwood from the Pacific Northwest, and we distilled that as well. Now, we've seen some inconsistencies in the domestic stuff based upon where it is, but it is interesting because it's a completely different environment that we're dealing with than from Europe. And so we distilled these separately to taste them on their own to see, were they a little different or were they dramatically different? And what we determined is they were dramatically different. And knowing where that wormwood is grown and what its properties are when it's distilled is a very important thing to know. You get to phenols. Phenols, there's 14, 16 different cultivars of Italian phenols. Juan Roman, Romanesco, Di Sicilia. These are different cultivars where you're still dealing with a fennel, but they have vastly different qualities to them. Di Sicilia has a spiciness. It's most commonly used in Italian sausage for a spicy finish to it. Wadded Roman is kind of this almost sweet, very mild type of flavor. Romanesco is, has even other different properties. So just the choice of fennel can make a big difference. And if you just threw these into a still together and distill them, it's hard to kind of pick out those qualities, and maybe you don't like the way the absinthe is turning out, but you don't know which ingredient is contributing maybe a flavor that you're not warming up to. But how do you pick it out? The only way you can really pick it out is to size them up individually and then say, look, I want an absinthe that's going to finish off with a spicy character, so I want to use Di Sicilia as our fennel. And I like the sweetness and the mildness of the Hungarian wormwood, so I want to use the Hungarian wormwood. So I thought it would be very helpful to bring these tinctures. We did 5-liter distillations for each of these, so I don't have a lot of it. But I felt it was a good opportunity for you folks to try and see the differences between wormwoods from different terroirs, to see, try 3 different fennel cultivars to see what those differences are. And then, as you taste through the absinthe, you're going to start to be able to really isolate, some of the qualities that are indicative of what comes from the fennel. What are the qualities that come from the wormwood? When you smell wormwood on its own, or when you taste wormwood on its own, you don't necessarily really get all the attributes that come when it's actually distilled. Because like I said, if you macerate or just soak the wormwood in alcohol, you get all that bitterness. When you go ahead and macerate it, a lot of that bitterness stays in the still, almost to the degree that when you're dealing with an absinthe vert, a green absinthe, it undergoes a secondary process, and that secondary process is where you create what's called an esprit de vert, which is a green concentrate. So what would essentially happen is you put in your herbs in the still. You have your wormwood, your anise, your fennel. Different regions of France in particular had different ratios. Some had more fennel, some had more anise than others, some had equal amounts of wormwood, anise, and fennel. But then you'd have other things like coriander, hyssop, melissa, things like that. When you distill it, it comes over and it's clear. You need to let the absinthe rest for at least 30 days to let all the flavors marry thoroughly and also get out what's called still shock. If you taste absinthe right out of the still, it's going to taste a certain way. You come back 24 hours later, it's different. 48 hours later, even different still. So it's very important to let it rest and to really unwind, as they say, because it's gone through a very dramatic chemical process of the alcohol and the essential oils from the herbs being turned essentially into vapor that then recondenses, and so it's almost like Star Trek, where you're breaking apart the molecules and transporting them and putting them back again. So it's a little traumatic for the spirit. So you let it rest, and then after at least 30 days, and some aged it even longer. Historically, some of the best brands age things for up to a year. And the longer an absinthe sits and rests, the better, more integrated, and the more refined the quality. It makes a very good finished product, like an aged cognac almost. You would take 10% of the distillate, you'd warm it up to about 80, 90 degrees, and then you would take in a mesh bag some additional herbs. In this case, petit wormwood is a miniature cousin of grand wormwood that is used in the master distillation. And you'd also have things typically like hyssop and melissa, and you'd steep that mesh bag in that warm distillate for about 30 minutes. And what that does is it leaches out additional oils and flavors, essentially gives it top notes or finishing notes. But what it leaves behind is chlorophyll, and that's how you get your green. In the case of the Swiss Le Bleu, they don't do that secondary step, so they'll actually add all the herbs they're going to use in the absinthe, go straight into the still, because once it's distilled, then they're done dealing with it. Whereas, because of the different flavor qualities, you kind of